I knew something was wrong the moment my security light snapped on. At first I thought it was raccoons again until I heard boots. Heavy boots. Then the shouting started. HOA police open. The door, you're out of compliance. Through my bedroom window I watched a swarm of grown adults in cheap navy shirts, plastic badges and dollar store flashlights storm across my yard like they were raiding a drug cartel. One of them kicked over my flower bed. Another started pounding on my siding with a baton. A third was taking photos like he was building a case for the Supreme Court. They thought I was some harmless old man, an easy target. Someone they could intimidate into paying fake HOA fees for a neighborhood I was never even part of. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that I spent 40 years enforcing real laws. And the night they raided my home, they picked the wrong house. Before we get into the full story, comment where you're watching from and what time it is over there, and if you enjoy HOA revenge tales, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. When the sun came up the morning after that ridiculous raid, the neighborhood looked exactly the same. Quiet streets, trimmed hedges, and families walking their dogs like nothing ever happened. But something had changed for me. I'd lived through cartel stings, federal investigations, and 3 interstate manhunts, yet I had never seen anything quite as pathetic and somehow more infuriating than a group of HOA wannabe cops vandalizing my property under the cover of darkness. But to understand why they were targeting me at all, you need the backstory, because this didn't happen overnight. This HOA was born sick. I moved into this neighborhood 15 years ago, long before the self-appointed royalty of the HOA decided they needed to elevate community standards. Back then, we were just a quiet collection of retirees, veterans, mechanics, teachers, good people who minded their business. The kind of place where neighbors waved from the porch, kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sac, and folks spent more time grilling hamburgers than measuring fence heights. Then came the newcomers, the ones who wanted the neighborhood to modernize. They printed glossy brochures, held meetings at the clubhouse, talked about preserving property values and uniform aesthetics. Before we knew it, they'd voted themselves into existence as the new HOA board. Here's the funny part. Joining was optional for existing homeowners. Only new residents were automatically enrolled. You'd think that would settle things right. Wrong. Because a few people simply can't handle the idea that someone else is free. When those first letters arrived demanding that I register with the HOA, I tossed them straight into the trash. I'd dealt with real bureaucrats during my career. Actual authorities with badges, legal codes, and jurisdiction. Compared to them, this HOA felt like a children's clubhouse with extra paperwork. I ignored letter after letter. They escalated to final notice. Then assessment warning. Then immediate action required. I wasn't angry at first, just annoyed. But soon their persistence took an uglier turn. One afternoon, a woman I had never seen before marched right up my driveway with a clipboard in her hands. Slim, sharp-eyed, stiff posture like she practiced scolding people in the mirror every morning. She introduced herself as Linda, the HOA president. "Sir," she said in a tone that suggested even my breathing was inconvenient, "we've noticed you haven't responded to our enrollment requirements." I told her point blank that I wasn't a member, never agreed to be one, and had no intention of participating. Her smile froze. "You don't get to decide that." I raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I most definitely do." For a moment she just stood there, eyes narrowed, clutching her clipboard so tight I thought it might snap in half. Then she spun on her heel and walked away, muttering something into her phone. That was the day she decided I was her personal enemy. After that, the so-called violations started piling up. Unauthorized bird feeder, grass too tall, grass too short, mailbox not regulation color, holiday lights left up too long, trash cans not placed at the correct angle. I refused every notice. I didn't owe them a penny. I didn't owe them compliance. Hell, I didn't even owe them eye contact. And that's when they formed the HOA officer program. Imagine this. A group of middle-aged volunteers wearing dark shirts with the words HOA, Enforcement Unit, printed in crooked white vinyl letters. Plastic badges ordered from a kid's birthday party catalog. Cheap walkie-talkies with no batteries. Clipboards full of imaginary regulations. It was like watching adults play police officer without any of the training authority or dignity. They weren't dangerous, not in the way real criminals are, but they were relentless. They'd show up at all hours, knocking, shouting, taking pictures, leaving warning slips under my doormat. A few of them even stood on my lawn patrolling the perimeter, as though my rose bushes posed a threat to national security. It got worse when they realized I still wasn't breaking. One night, around 11 p.m., I noticed headlights sweeping across my living room walls. I checked my front window and saw two HOA patrol cars, actually just golf carts, with reflective tape slapped on. They parked at the curb and three officers strutted out with flashlights like they had warrants to serve. I stepped onto my porch and crossed my arms. "Can I help you boys?" One of them, a heavy-set guy with a baseball cap labeled Chief, spoke with the authority of someone who'd watched exactly one episode of Cops. "You're in violation of HOA ORD," I cut him off. "I'm not in your HOA." He puffed out his chest. "Everyone in this community must follow our standards." "No," I said calmly. "Only the people who signed the contract." He sputtered and threatened to escalate the issue. I told him to have a good night. He told me I'd regret this. Spoiler, I didn't. They did. Weeks passed, and their visits became more brazen. Daytime surveillance, nighttime harassment, doorbell ringing until sunrise. They treated my property like their personal training ground, trying to push me into joining out of sheer exhaustion. But I wasn't budging. I had spent decades staring down criminals who were smarter, faster, and far more dangerous. A few HOA volunteers weren't going to break me. What they didn't understand, what they didn't bother to investigate, was who I really was. They just saw a gray-haired man with a quiet routine and assumed weakness. They didn't know about my past. They didn't know about the federal badge locked in my safe. They didn't know I wasn't just familiar with the law, I spent my life enforcing it. So when things finally reached their breaking point, when they crossed the line from harassment into outright criminal behavior, I didn't react like a civilian. I reacted like a sheriff. And that brings us to the night of the raid. The night they decided to invade my property with flashlights and crowbars like they were taking down a drug den. The night they recorded themselves vandalizing my windows, ripping up my yard, shouting threats through my front door, all while my security cameras captured every second in crystal clear HD. The night they proved beyond any question that they believed they were above the law. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And the next morning, while they celebrated their little victory, I wasn't sweeping up broken glass. I was preparing a case. A real case, filed with real authorities, using real criminal codes. Because the HOA might have thought they owned the neighborhood, but the law still belonged to me. The morning after the raid, the air felt different, still heavy, charged with the kind of tension you'd find right before a thunderstorm. I stepped outside with a mug of black coffee and surveyed the damage. My mailbox sat crooked, hanging by a single screw like it had given up on life. Shards of my window glittered across the grass. Deep boot prints scarred the flower beds I'd tended for years. They even carved a warning into the dirt with a stick like some primitive tribe marking territory, "Pay your HOA dues." Imagine having a group of grown adults, people with mortgages, careers, kids running around at night carving threats into someone's yard. It would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. As I walked around photographing the destruction, a couple neighbors peeked out from behind curtains. Not one came out. Not one asked if I was all right. Fear does that to people. Makes them quiet, makes them complicit. The HOA loved that silence. But silence was something I'd never been good at. Around 9 a.m., a sleek silver SUV rolled slowly down the street and stopped at the edge of my driveway. The driver's window lowered, and out popped the familiar tightly stretched smile of Linda, the iron-fisted queen of the HOA, the self-appointed keeper of suburban order. She stepped out, heels clacking on the pavement clipboard tucked under her arm like it gave her authority. Her perfume wafted across the yard, sharp, artificial, like the scent you find in department store bathrooms. "Good morning," she chirped, though her eyes were scanning the damage like a general assessing a battlefield. "I see you've had quite the incident." I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence hang between us. "You know exactly what happened." She placed a hand over her chest in dramatic offense. "I beg your pardon, I've only just arrived. I have no idea who would do such a thing." Then she smirked just barely, but I caught it. "Of course, if you were a member of the HOA, we could offer certain protections." Protections? She actually said it like she was running a suburban mafia. I took a step closer enough that she had to tilt her head back to look me in the eye. "Are you implying that your officers did this?" She blinked innocently. "Officers? Oh, you're referring to the community patrol volunteers. They keep an eye out for rule breakers, and vandals, and people who endanger property values." My laugh came out slow and sharp. "Lady, the only vandals around here are wearing your t-shirts." Finally the mask cracked. She straightened her blazer and snapped her fingers. Two men stepped out of the SUV, broad-shouldered, stone-faced, wearing those ridiculous HOA enforcement unit shirts. One even had sunglasses on despite the overcast sky. Linda crossed her arms triumphantly. "You're becoming a problem, Mr. Harris." I sipped my coffee. "I've been a problem to criminals for 40 years. You're not special." Her nostrils flared. Her goons stiffened. And that's when I realized something important. They didn't fear me. They didn't respect the law. They believed the HOA was the law. I'd seen delusion before. It always ended the same way. When they finally left after Linda threatened fines, legal action, and something she called mandatory compliance review, I went back inside and retrieved a heavy metal lockbox from the top shelf of my hall closet. Inside was my federal badge. It wasn't active duty anymore, but I still held limited investigative authority under federal retirement statutes. Most retirees frame their badges. I kept mine functional. I ran my thumb over the emblem, feeling the weight of years built into the metal. This wasn't about a broken window or a ruined flower bed. This was about power misused, distorted, weaponized by people who never should have had it. By noon, I drove into town and requested a meeting with the county sheriff. A big man named Turner, good guy, good instincts, but stretched thin like every small-town department. I laid out the photos, the timestamps, the evidence of trespassing, vandalism, harassment, and impersonating law enforcement. Turner's face darkened. "These HOA volunteers did all this." "HOA doesn't call them volunteers," I corrected. "They call them officers." He let out a slow whistle. "Impersonating an officer is a felony." "They didn't impersonate cops," I said. "They impersonated authority. That's even worse." He rubbed his hands together and leaned back. "We can start an investigation, but if they run, hide, or deny involvement, we'll need something airtight." I smiled. "Don't worry, I've got airtight." That night I set up additional cameras, hidden ones, motion-triggered recording straight to encrypted cloud storage. The HOA officers weren't exactly subtle, so I knew they'd be back. People like that always push 1 inch further, always test limits to see how much fear they can squeeze out of someone. Sure enough, at 2:14 a.m., the cameras lit up. This time it wasn't the whole squad, just the chief, the heavy-set guy who tried to intimidate me weeks earlier. He strutted into my yard with a flashlight, took photos of my driveway, and muttered into a cheap radio like he was on a tactical mission. Then, he spotted one of my new cameras, not hidden, just installed openly under the eaves. He froze, stared right into it, then flipped the middle finger with juvenile satisfaction. After that, he kicked over the pot of geraniums by the porch and trotted back to his golf cart. It wasn't much, but it was enough. You don't need a hurricane to charge someone with breaking and entering. Sometimes all it takes is a gust of stupidity. The next morning, Turner called me. "I've checked your footage. Everything's admissible. We're greenlit." But just as he said that, another call buzzed through one I almost ignored until I recognized the number. It was my old supervisor from the federal office. I hadn't heard from him in years. When I answered, his voice was calm, steady. "We reviewed the materials you sent. You weren't kidding. This HOA situation is escalating beyond local jurisdiction." "I told you," I said. "They're impersonating authority, extorting non-members, and organizing coordinated harassment." He cleared his throat. "We're authorizing you to act as a federal liaison. You'll have full support if you choose to move forward." There it was, the moment everything shifted, the moment the game stopped being a nuisance and became a case. That same afternoon, patrol cars rolled into the neighborhood, not sirens blaring, just cruising slow and silent like sharks circling. Officers knocked on doors. They asked questions. They took statements from neighbors, most of whom confessed they'd been too scared to speak up before. By sunset, word had spread. The HOA wasn't just in trouble. They were being investigated. And when people are cornered, they do stupid things. Linda showed up on my doorstep just before dark mascara-smeared voice, shaking not with fear but rage. "You've ruined everything," she shrieked. "Do you know how long we've worked to build this community? Do you know how hard we've tried to maintain standards?" I folded my arms. "Standards don't include harassment, property destruction, and running a pretend police force." Her eyes burned. "You think you're special because you're some federal retiree." I didn't correct her. No need. The real fun was letting her wonder just how much trouble she was actually in. She jabbed a finger toward my chest. "We're not done. You'll regret this." I stepped closer, letting the porch light catch my badge resting on my hip. Her eyes widened, not because she understood, but because for the first time she saw something she couldn't bully. "You already made your mistake," I said quietly, "and you're about to regret every minute of it." She backed away, slowly breathing hard, then fled to her SUV. Only later did I find out she wasn't running home. She was running to gather her HOA officers for one last act of desperation. And that act, it would become their downfall. The night they made their final mistake began like any other quiet, still too calm for a neighborhood that had been simmering on the edge of madness for months. I'd gotten used to checking the cameras before bed, making rounds on my own property, double-checking every lock. Not because I was scared fear is a luxury I unlearned decades ago, but because dealing with idiots requires diligence, not courage. Around 1:17 a.m., motion alerts lit up my phone. At first I expected another lone troublemaker, maybe the chief again kicking over planters to assert dominance like an angry toddler. But when I opened the live feed I saw something different, something bigger. 5 figures, all wearing dark navy, all wearing those ridiculous HOA enforcement shirts, all carrying tools, crowbars, mallets, a shovel, and something that looked suspiciously like bolt cutters. They moved with purpose. They moved like they had a plan. And they moved straight toward my house. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't grab the gun locked in my nightstand, though the thought crossed my mind. Instead, I slipped quietly through the hallway, watching the monitors as they approached the side gate. My cameras caught every angle, wide-shot infrared night vision, crystal-clear faces. Even the little embroidered patches on their sleeves reading HOA Patrol, Unit 1. It would have been laughable if they weren't actively breaking the law. They forced the gate open with the bolt cutters splintering the wood. One man whispered, "Hurry up before he wakes up." Another answered, "He's old. He sleeps like a rock." Wrong again. I watched them spread out across the yard like a poorly trained SWAT team. 2 headed for my shed. One began prying at my back door. Another stomped through my vegetable garden, crushing everything he stepped on. The chief barked orders like he thought he was leading a hostage rescue. "This is what happens when you defy the HOA," he muttered. "We teach the lesson once, and everyone else falls in line." It was more than vandalism now. This was coordinated retaliation. This was a criminal enterprise disguised as a neighborhood club. And they were too blind, too arrogant, too stupid to realize that their entire operation was being recorded from 4 separate angles. I stayed inside just long enough to capture enough footage for prosecution: trespassing, destruction of property, breaking, and entering conspiracy harassment. Then I slipped out the front door, silent as a shadow circling wide around the house. Years of federal fieldwork came back like muscle memory. I moved through the darkness with practiced ease, keeping low, each footstep placed exactly where it needed to be. As I rounded the corner, I saw the chief smashing a window with the handle of a shovel. Glass rained down. The man beside him cheered like a kid watching fireworks. Another was inside my shed tossing tools across the floor. I stepped into the open, letting the moonlight hit me. Evening, gentlemen. The effect was immediate. The chief jumped so hard he dropped the shovel. One man stumbled backward into my tomato plants. Another froze mid-swing with his crowbar. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't take a threatening stance. I just stood there, one hand resting casually on my hip, near, but not on my badge. Real law enforcement posture, relaxed but ready. "You boys seem busy tonight," I said. Working on a home improvement project, the chief regained a bit of swagger, puffed out his chest, and spat at the ground. "You're out of compliance, old man. HOA regulations don't apply to me," I interrupted, stepping forward. "And you know it. That's why you came at night with tools you didn't have the guts to use during the day." He clenched his jaw. "We enforce the rules around here." "No," I said calmly. "You enforce delusions." His face twitched, eyes narrowing. "You think you're smarter than us. You think the real police are going to help you. They won't. This is HOA business, neighborhood business." I let out a low chuckle. "Oh, you poor fools. You really don't know who you're talking to." The one holding the crowbar took a timid step back. "Maybe we should go," he whispered. But the chief, drunk on power and stupidity, shook his head violently. "No, not until he learns his place," I sighed. "Fine." I reached slowly into my jacket. All 5 men tensed, expecting a weapon. But what emerged wasn't a gun, it was my federal badge. Heavy polished, unmistakable. The chief squinted at it, trying to decipher what he was looking at. One of the men actually gasped. "You?" he stammered. "You're a cop, federal sheriff," I corrected. "Retired but still authorized under Section 21 to act as liaison for active investigations, which, by the way, I'm currently doing." The chief paled so fast he looked like he'd seen a ghost. You can't prove anything." I raised my phone and tapped the screen. The motion cameras played a perfect replay of the last 20 minutes. The break-in, the vandalism, the threats, every face clearly visible, every voice clearly recorded. "I don't need to prove anything," I said. "You just did it for me." One man dropped his crowbar and raised his hands. "I didn't know I thought this was legal," she told us, she said. "Linda, I finished for him." Of course she did. That's when the distant glow of headlights appeared at the end of the street, 2 patrol cars, silent but fast. The chief whipped around. "You called the cops." "No," I said. "They've been watching the cloud footage in real time. You tripped the automatic forward system." I leaned in slightly. "Congratulations. You just upgraded your little HOA tantrum into a criminal case." The first patrol car stopped abruptly, and Sheriff Turner stepped out, followed by 2 deputies. He shined his flashlight over the scene and shook his head slowly. "Gentlemen," he said, voice cool as steel, "put the tools down. Keep your hands where we can see them." The chief looked at me, eyes full of panic. "You set us up." "No," I said. "I warned you." Turner cuffed him, first reading him his rights. The others followed, some protesting, some crying, one trying to run before tripping over my broken flower bed. It would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. As they were loaded into the patrol cars, the chief screamed, "Linda will bail us out. She runs this neighborhood. You can't beat the HOA." I leaned into the window, meeting his furious stare. "Linda's next." His expression collapsed, all bravado gone. When the cars drove off into the night, the street fell silent again. I stood there in the moonlight glass, crunching under my boots, breathing in the cool air. It was over. At least, the raid part was. But the war with the HOA had only just begun. The morning after the arrests, the neighborhood pulsed with a strange kind of energy, half fear, half fascination, and a good dose of gossip simmering under the surface. Curtains twitched when I stepped onto my porch. Cars slowed as they rolled past my driveway, drivers pretending not to stare while craning their necks at the same time. You could practically taste the panic in the air. The HOA had ruled this place like a tin pot dictatorship for years. But now that the officers were in handcuffs down at the county jail, a lot of people were suddenly reconsidering their loyalties. My phone buzzed non-stop that morning, unknown numbers, worried neighbors, even a couple folks from across the street asking if the rumors were true. One voice trembled as she whispered, "Are we safe now?" Another said, "We've all wanted to stand up to them, but we didn't know how. They shouldn't have needed me. They shouldn't have needed anyone." But fear can make even decent people fold in on themselves like paper. Still, I appreciated the sentiment. By noon, Sheriff Turner called and asked me to come down to the station to make an official statement. I grabbed my badge, my paperwork, the video files, and drove to town with the windows down and the wind washing away what little stress I carried. Inside the sheriff's department, the place buzzed like a kicked beehive. Deputies hustled between desks, holding folders, evidence bags, digital tablets loaded with reports. I caught snippets of conversation as I walked past. Impersonating an officer is a felony. Multiple counts of trespassing HOA. Board president might have coordinated it. Judge already approved the preliminary warrants. When Turner spotted me, waved me inside his office, closed the door, and let out a long sigh. "You weren't kidding," he said, rubbing his temples. "This isn't a simple vandalism case. This is a full-blown illegal operation." I sat across from him. "Told you." He slid a stack of printed forms across his desk. The chief and the others confessed to the break-in. They also admitted that Linda encouraged it. According to them, she called it a compliance strike. I raised an eyebrow. "She gave the order, looks like it," he said. "And she's claiming ignorance naturally." "Of course she is." Turner leaned forward. "But that's where you come in." I nodded. The real twist was only beginning. My federal badge wasn't just for show, it gave me the authority to work directly between local law enforcement and federal authorities, especially in cases involving harassment, intimidation, and organized misconduct by any community-based organization. It wasn't something I flaunted, but it was something I used when necessary. And this was necessary. We spent the next 3 hours reviewing every bit of evidence. I gave my formal statement, signed affidavits, verified the camera timestamps, and walked Turner through each incident, the letters, the threats, the midnight patrols, and of course the raid. By the time I walked out of the station, the sun hung low and golden over Main Street, and waiting by my truck, arms crossed, sunglasses on, was someone I hadn't expected to see, Special Agent Mariano. I hadn't seen her since I'd retired. She'd been one of the sharpest agents I'd ever worked with, intimidatingly competent, annoyingly logical, and always 5 steps ahead. Her expression softened just slightly when I approached. "Sheriff Harris," she said playfully, like she was teasing me for holding on to the title. "Agent Mariano," I replied. Didn't expect to see you this far from headquarters. We received your packet, she said, tapping a thick folder she held. Interesting reading, by the way. Most HOA cases we review involve overgrown lawns or disputes about Christmas lights. Yours. This one's new. Lucky me. We're classifying it as a coordinated harassment case with indicators of unlawful authority assumption. She lowered her sunglasses, which means we're officially stepping in. I felt a quiet satisfaction settle into my chest. The HOA had poked the wrong bear. Mariano continued, we're preparing federal subpoenas for HOA board communications, financial records, patrol logs if they exist, and internal messages. The district judge approved expedited processing. I couldn't help but grin. You're moving fast. You've done half the work for us, she shrugged. All we need now is one more thing. And what's that? A confession from the president. I laughed. Good luck. She'll lie before she breathes. Mariano smirked. That's why we'd like you to help. Now I may be retired, but there's a certain thrill that comes with slipping back into old habits, with confronting corruption head-on, with watching someone who's abused power finally get cornered. So I agreed. That evening we drove back into the neighborhood in an unmarked SUV. The sunset cast a warm orange glow over the houses, making everything look calm and peaceful. Too peaceful, considering the storm brewing beneath the surface. When we pulled up in front of Linda's two-story home, her car was already there. Curtains drawn. Porch light off. Mariano and I stepped out. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again louder. A shuffle of footsteps inside. A whispered voice. Then finally the door creaked open. Linda appeared, eyes swollen from crying, makeup smeared like melted wax. But even in her panic, she tried wearing that same cold superiority she was famous for. What do you want? She snapped. Mariano flashed her credentials. Federal investigation. We have questions. If looks could kill, I'd have evaporated on the spot. Her glare could have cut through steel. You, she hissed at me. You brought the feds here. For what, a misunderstanding? Funny I said your officers didn't call it a misunderstanding. They called it an operation. Her lips trembled. They wouldn't. They don't know what they're talking about. Mariano pulled a tablet from her bag and tapped the screen. A recorded confession played audio from the chief's interrogation. It was clear as day. She told us to do it. Said the sheriff needed to be taught a lesson. Said the HOA needed to show strength. Linda's face drained of color. They lied. Mariano stared her down. We have texts, Mrs. Parker. That did it. Linda started shaking, tiny tremors at first, then bigger panicked waves. She clutched her clipboard like a life raft, even though it was useless now. This is my community, she whispered desperately. I built this neighborhood. I kept it clean, orderly. I gave people structure. You terrorized them, I corrected. She snapped. You refused to follow the rules, because I never signed up for your rules. She took a step back, shoulders slumping. You don't understand. If people don't follow the HOA, everything falls apart. We lose control. That, Mariano said, is the problem. For the first time, Linda truly looked defeated. Not angry, not superior, just small. A woman who'd clung so tightly to power that she'd lost her grip on reality. Mariano asked her again, Did you authorize the raid? Linda stared at the floor. Her voice was barely a whisper. Yes, and that was it. Mariano recorded the admission, read her the procedures, and informed her she would be formally charged. When she finished, we stepped back from the porch and left Linda standing alone, clutching her clipboard like it could undo the damage. As we walked toward the SUV, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes. Vindication, absolutely. But also a deep, heavy exhaustion. This wasn't a victory lap. It was the end of a long, unnecessary war. And the fallout, it was only just beginning. The following weeks felt like watching a dam crack open, slow at first, then all at once, everything collapsing under the weight of truth. Once Linda's confession was officially recorded, the wheels of justice spun faster than the HOA could blink. Subpoenas rolled out. Board members were questioned. Financial ledgers were seized. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood looked the HOA in the eye and saw not authority, but fraud. Yet, as anyone who's dealt with suburban tyrants knows, these battles don't end neatly. They end messily with panic excuses and desperate grabs for control. And that's exactly what happened. 3 days after Linda's confession, I returned home from the sheriff's department to find a stack of envelopes in my mailbox. Not the usual flyers or bills. These were HOA-branded glossy paper gold trim, proudly stamped with their tacky motto, Order is Community, Community is Order. But the contents, pure delusion. The first letter demanded immediate payment of 6 years' worth of HOA dues penalties and retroactive non-member compliance fees. The second letter threatened property liens. The third claimed I owed them emotional reparations for disharmony caused by involving law enforcement. I laughed so loud I scared the neighbor's cat. It was their last attempt at asserting dominance paper threats from an organization about to crumble. But when people lose power, they cling to it with desperation, and that desperation was about to tear them apart from the inside. The next morning, my neighbor Eleanor shuffled across the street, 72 years old, soft-spoken, and more terrified of the HOA than she'd ever been of the government wild animals or the apocalypse. She clutched a stack of letters to her chest. "They came last night," she whispered, eyes darting around as though the bushes might be recording us. Banged on my door. Said I needed to sign a petition. "What kind of petition?" I asked. "To remove you," she said, "and to reinstate the HOA officers." I sighed. "Eleanor, did you sign it?" "Goodness, no." She slapped my arm with surprising force. "I may be old, but I'm not stupid. I told them if they came back, I'd call the sheriff." She leaned in, voice trembling. "They're scared, you know. They're really scared." She wasn't wrong. Just before sunset, 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled in to serve additional warrants. Kids peered from doorways. Parents whispered nervously. HOA board members scattered like ants under boiling water. You could practically smell the fear. Later that night, my phone buzzed again, this time from Agent Mariano. "Got a minute?" she asked. "Always." "We pulled the HOA's email server," she said. "Found digital copies of those ridiculous officer badges they printed, plus a message chain where they tried to coordinate a smear campaign. Against me. Against anyone who questioned them. But yes, mostly you." She paused. "You've got quite the fan club. I always attract the charming ones." Anyway, she continued, voice shifting into that crisp federal tone, "They also created a fake internal regulation manual. 27 pages of made-up laws to justify their behavior." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "They wrote their own laws. They tried to act like a sovereign nation," Mariano said. "But here's the kicker they used. HOA funds to buy equipment for their officer program. Cameras, uniforms, radios, even those cheap golf cart patrol cars. That's misappropriation, tax fraud, and depending on intent, possibly racketeering." I let out a low whistle. "They're done." "Pretty much," she said. "But the judge wants you present at the preliminary hearing. Your testimony is key. Just tell me when," I said. "Tomorrow morning." I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was worried, but because I felt something I hadn't felt in years: anticipation. The kind that coils inside your chest before a major arrest or a massive takedown. Except this time the perpetrators weren't cartel leaders or fugitives or violent offenders. They were neighbors. Suburban tyrants drunk on authority they manufactured out of thin air. The courthouse buzzed with reporters the next morning. HOA scandals weren't exactly national news, but impersonating law enforcement, coordinated raids, misappropriated funds, that drew attention. Inside the board, members sat at a long defense table, faces pale, shoulders slumped. Linda avoided looking at me. The treasurer dabbed his forehead with a trembling hand. Another board member stared at the floor, as though hoping it would swallow him whole. When the judge called my name, I stepped forward calmly, not as a victim, not as a retired sheriff, but as a witness committed to exposing the truth. I detailed the harassment, the letters, the raids, the threats, the surveillance, the so-called officers. I played the footage from my cameras. The court watched silently as the HOA officers smashed my windows, tore up my garden, and strutted around barking orders like soldiers in a war zone. Linda shook her head violently, whispering, "No, no," as the evidence stacked against her like bricks sealing her own tomb. When I finished, the judge folded his hands. "This behavior," he said slowly, "is among the most egregious abuses of community authority I have seen in my tenure. HOA rules do not exist to override the law. They certainly do not exist to terrorize non-members. What we have here is not governance, it is vigilantism," the courtroom murmured. The judge continued, "I am authorizing full federal investigation into the HOA, its board, its finances, and the illegal officer program." Linda burst into tears. The treasurer groaned as though he'd been hit. One of the board members tried to stand, then collapsed back into his chair like his knees had liquefied. It wasn't joy I felt, not victory, but a deep settling justice. Over the next few weeks, investigators uncovered everything: fake invoices, embezzled funds, manipulated votes, threats against dissenting homeowners, bribery attempts, and even internal messages celebrating the raid on my home. It was a spiderweb of corruption woven by people who thought neighborhood power made them untouchable. HOA officers, those pathetic cosplay cops, turned on the board to save themselves. Board members turned on Linda. Linda turned on everyone. The entire organization collapsed. Neighbors I barely knew came to my door with baked goods, thank you notes, relief shining on their faces. One man broke down crying, saying, "You saved us." I didn't know how to protect my family from them, but not everyone was grateful. A small group of diehard HOA loyalists marched down my street holding signs that read, "You destroyed our community. Bring back order OA forever." They shouted accusations, called me a tyrant, said I'd ruined the neighborhood. I just sipped my coffee on the porch and watched them strut around like confused chickens. Because the truth, the community wasn't destroyed. It was set free. And freedom scares people who thrive under control. Yet even then, even after everything unraveled, the HOA tried one last desperate attempt to escape consequences. Their lawyers filed a motion claiming I had entrapped them, that I provoked the raid, that my cameras violated their privacy, that their actions were community enforcement duties. The judge denied it in 11 seconds. With every avenue of defense collapsing, the HOA faced its final reckoning. But justice wasn't complete yet. There was still one more battle ahead, one that would determine the future of the neighborhood, the fate of the officers, and whether the HOA itself would survive at all. And that battle, it would be the most explosive yet. The weeks leading up to the final hearing felt like the slow tightening of a noose, one woven not from rope, but from evidence, testimonies, and years of pent-up frustration finally boiling to the surface. Every day, more residents stepped forward to share what the HOA had done to them. Stories that had been whispered in backyards and murmured at kitchen tables suddenly spilled into the open. A young couple admitted the HOA had fined them $600 because their welcome mat did not align with neighborhood color tones. A retired veteran confessed Linda once threatened to tow his truck because it had aggressive tires. A single mother said she was called a community disruption for letting her children draw chalk art on the sidewalk. And then there was Mr. Alvarez, 83 years old, soft-spoken cane tapping on the pavement as he walked to my door one afternoon. He told me the HOA demanded he remove the small wooden ramp he'd built for his wheelchair-bound wife because it was not HOA approved. She had passed away 13 months earlier, and they never let him forget the ramp. That one nearly broke me. People like Linda and her officers weren't just bullies. They were predators who fed on compliance, on silence, on people too scared to fight back. Now the entire community was rising, trembling, but determined, and they wanted justice, not just punishment, but dismantling. The federal team worked day and night. Agent Mariano coordinated interviews, evidence collection, subpoenas, and cross-jurisdictional paperwork with the precision of a surgeon. And though she never said it out loud, I could tell she enjoyed watching an HOA implode under its own arrogance almost as much as I did. About a week before the final hearing, a federal van pulled into the neighborhood to collect board members for questioning. It wasn't an arrest yet, but the sight alone sent a ripple of panic through the street. Cars backed out with screeching tires. Curtains snapped shut. A few people ran back indoors, like they feared the van might absorb them through osmosis. That night, someone slipped an anonymous note under my door. Just a scrap of torn yellow paper with shaky handwriting. "Thank you. You saved US." I placed it on my fridge. I still have it. But while neighbors were waking up, the HOA loyalists were unraveling. Their little Bring Back the HOA march had grown to a dozen people, now angry, loud, waving handmade signs like the world was ending. They walked past my house every morning chanting about lawlessness, collapse, and community betrayal. The irony was rich like a chocolate cake made entirely from hypocrisy. One morning as I picked up the newspaper, a man from the group, bald, red-faced, veins popping from his forehead, stepped forward. "This is your fault," he growled. "You ruined our structure, our order." "Order," I said. "You mean oppression." He jabbed a finger at me. "We had harmony until you got involved." "Harmony isn't fear," I replied. "It's freedom." He sputtered for a moment, then stormed off to rejoin his tiny revolution. That was the last time they bothered me. Realizing they were fighting a losing battle, the movement dwindled to nothing within a few days. When the day of the final hearing arrived, the courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the sidewalk, microphones extended like hungry mouths waiting for sound bites. Residents crowded the stairs. Even the judge looked unusually energized. This wasn't just about an HOA anymore. It was about a case that could set precedent for HOAs across the state. Inside the courtroom, I sat behind Agent Mariano as the proceedings began. The board members were ushered to their seats, no longer smug or confident. They looked hollow. Linda, in particular, wore the expression of someone who finally understood the cost of her crusade. The judge began by reviewing each charge: harassment, vandalism, trespassing, misappropriation of funds, forgery of documents, impersonation of authority, coordinating an illegal activity disguised as community enforcement. It took him nearly 5 minutes just to read the list. Then came the moment, the big one, the question that would determine the HOA's future. Does this association, the judge said, slowly constitute a functional, lawful governing body capable of continuing operations? Before anyone could speak, a murmur swept through the courtroom. You could feel the tension thicken like fog. The HOA's lawyer, a thin, nervous man with more hair gel than dignity, stood and began a pathetic defense about administrative misunderstandings and miscommunications in enforcement. Mariano rose so smoothly you'd think she had springs under her shoes. Your Honor, she said, this was not a misunderstanding. This was an organized abuse of power. This was a ruling class, operating without checks, accountability, or legal basis. This was coercion. This was fear. The judge nodded. Proceed. She played audio recordings, showed financial charts, displayed images of altered ledgers. She revealed screenshots of internal messages from board members planning discipline actions against non-compliant residents. She even produced a draft document titled Mandatory Community Authority Expansion, which Linda had apparently planned to vote on next year. When the judge turned to Linda, her voice wavered like a dying radio signal. I only wanted order, she whispered. That's what a community needs. It needs fairness, the judge corrected, not tyranny. Then came my turn. I walked to the stand, placed my hand on the Bible, and sat. The courtroom grew quiet, stretched thin with attention. I kept my voice level, calm, professional. I described the harassment, the threats, the raids, the fake officers, the damage to my property. I described the fear my neighbors had endured, fear of fines, fear of retaliation, fear of the very people who claimed to keep them safe. When I finished, the judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I've presided over disputes between HOAs and residents for 23 years, he said. But this is unprecedented, he leaned forward. This HOA is hereby stripped of all governing authority and is to be dissolved effective immediately. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Linda collapsed into her chair. The treasurer whimpered. A few residents clapped before remembering they were in court. The judge wasn't done. All funds, collected over the past 3 fiscal years, must be audited and redistributed where appropriate. Any individuals found guilty of criminal behavior will face charges. This court will not tolerate any abuse of authority masked as community management. When the hearing adjourned, the room exploded with movement. Reporters rushed forward. Residents hugged. A few of the former officers were escorted out in cuffs, and amid the chaos, Agent Mariano approached me with a small smile. You did good, she said. I didn't do it alone. That's what makes it good, she replied. Community finally fought back. I stepped outside into the sunlight and felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time: peace. Not the fragile peace that trembles at every shadow, but a solid, rooted peace that comes only when justice has been done. That night, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, the wind carried the sounds of laughter from down the street, neighbors celebrating the end of a long nightmare. The HOA signs had been torn down, the fake patrol carts impounded. The neighborhood finally breathed freely again. For the first time in years, the street felt like home. But even then, even after justice had been served, there was still one last chapter to close. One final act, one final decision, one final confrontation that would bring everything full circle, and it would all happen sooner than I expected. The neighborhood looked different in the days after the HOA was dissolved. The air felt lighter, the colors brighter, as if someone had lifted a heavy curtain that had hung over our lives for far too long. Children rode their bikes again, not worried about getting noise violation letters. People repainted their shutters, planted flowers, hung wind chimes, all the small personal touches that make a house a home. Without the HOA's shadow looming overhead, freedom returned in subtle ways, like the easing of a clenched fist. But even freedom has a cost. And closure requires facing the last loose thread: Linda. While most of the board faced formal charges, Linda's case, because she had orchestrated the raid, was more complicated. She was out on bail, forbidden to contact any residents. But fear does strange things to a person shaped by power. And Linda, stripped of her title, her authority, and her applause, was unraveling. I learned this from Sheriff Turner one morning when he stopped by with paperwork for the restitution process. We served Linda her final notices, he said, standing on my porch with the tone of a man who'd seen too many strange things in a small town. She's not taking it well. How bad? I asked. Turner sighed. Neighbors say she's barricaded herself inside her home, shouting, throwing things, pacing for hours. Looks like she hasn't slept in days. Before I could respond, he added, "She keeps saying she needs to talk to you." I shook my head immediately. Absolutely not. He raised his hands. "I'm not telling you to, just making you aware." But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. People who cling to power as tightly as she did don't simply let go. They crumble, they claw, they search for any rope to hold onto, even if it's wrapped in thorns. 2 days later, just after sunset, I found a letter taped to my front door. Thin, stationary, shaky handwriting, the ink smudged in places as if she'd pressed too hard or cried over it. "Please, talk to me. I need to explain, Linda." I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. Yet that night, sleep didn't come easy. Not because I felt sorry for her, no pity was far from my mind, but because unfinished business gnawed at me. I'd lived too many years letting cases tie themselves into knots. Closure mattered. Finality mattered. And so the next afternoon when I saw her standing at the edge of my driveway, small, trembling, clutching her clipboard like a shield, I didn't walk back inside. I walked toward her. The neighborhood watched through parted blinds, their curiosity impossible to hide. You could feel their relief that it wasn't them facing her. You could feel their gratitude that someone else was finishing the story. As I approached, Linda looked broken. Her hair unkempt, her voice hoarse, her hands shaky. It was hard to believe this was the same woman who once struck fear into an entire community. She spoke first. "You destroyed everything." Her accusation hung in the air like smoke. I folded my arms. "No, Linda, you did that." She shook her head, eyes wet. "You don't understand. I kept the community together. People listened. They respected me. They feared you," I corrected. "Fear keeps order," she snapped. I stepped closer. "Fear isn't order. It's oppression wrapped in rules." Her throat worked as she swallowed hard. "You took away my life. Your life," I chuckled bitterly. "Linda, you made people terrified to put up a bird feeder." Her face twisted. "I gave them structure. You gave them nightmares." She clutched her clipboard tighter, knuckles white. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." "But you did," I said softly, letting the truth sit between us. "Every day. For years." Her shoulders sagged. "I don't know who I am without the HOA." There it was. The raw truth. The deepest fear. The confession she wasn't making in court, but making here to me in the middle of a quiet suburban street. "Then it's time to find out," I said. For a moment I saw something flicker in her eyes, maybe grief, maybe clarity, maybe both. She looked down. "They're going to jail, aren't they? All of them." "They made their choices," I replied. "And so did you." Will I go to prison?" "That's for the court to decide." She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I never meant for it to go this far." "Power never does," I said. "It starts small, then it grows until it consumes you." She took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry." Those were the last words she said before she turned and walked away. Slow, heavy steps back toward whatever future waited for her. A future without control. A future without followers. A future without the HOA. I watched until she disappeared into her house. Only when the door closed did I feel the tension leave my shoulders. It was done. Truly done. A week later, the final sentencing came down. Linda received probation, mandatory therapy, and a ban from holding any leadership position in any community organization for 10 years. The officers received various penalties, some fines, some community service, some short stints in county jail. The HOA formally terminated. Assets seized. Operations disbanded permanently. On the day the final order was posted, the neighborhood gathered in the cul-de-sac for the first time in years without fear. Someone brought barbecue. Someone else played music. Kids ran through sprinklers. Laughter filled the air like summer wind. Turner stopped by, grabbed a burger, and joked that it was the happiest he'd seen the neighborhood since he'd taken office. Agent Mariano visited too, leaning against her SUV with a rare smile. "You planning to run for HOA president?" she teased. I barked a laugh. "I'd rather patrol a skunk farm." "Fair," she said. "You did good, Sheriff. I just reminded a neighborhood what freedom looks like." She nodded. "And that's more than most people ever manage." When the sun dipped low and lanterns flickered to life, neighbors came to shake my hand, pat my back, thank me for standing up when they couldn't. I didn't need the praise. I didn't want the spotlight. but I accepted their gratitude with quiet humility. Not because I was a hero, but because justice once served deserves recognition. Later that night, when the crowd thinned and the street grew quiet, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched fireflies drift through the warm air. The world felt peaceful again, not perfect, not flawless, but fair. And sometimes fairness is enough, because at the end of the longest battles, what we really fight for isn't victory, it's dignity, it's safety, it's the right to live without fear in the place we call home. And as I took another sip, listening to the soft hum of crickets, one truth echoed in my mind. No one, not a board, not a badge, not a false authority, stands above the law. Not in my neighborhood, not on my watch, not ever again. In the end, this story isn't about an HOA or even about the raid. It's about what happens when ordinary people forget they have a voice. It's about how fear can silence a community, and how one spark, just one person willing to stand up, can light the way for everyone else. If there's a lesson here, it's this. Real power isn't in titles, uniforms, or threats. Real power is in courage, integrity, and the willingness to protect what's right, even when it's hard. We all deserve to feel safe in our own homes. We all deserve the freedom to live without intimidation. And sometimes doing the right thing isn't about being strong, it's about refusing to let others control you through fear. If you've ever dealt with a Karen, an abusive HOA, or someone who thought rules gave them power, you're not alone, and you're stronger than you think. Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting to be told.